Okay, nice to see you all again, and just by way of recap, a further welcome, and particularly to those who've not been able to join us here today. But the good news is we will have a video recording that will go out and they'll get the benefit of it. So who would have thought that Black Friday would have been followed by White Saturday, as has happened today, and caused not a little disruption to us in getting here. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker, Nicholas Rankin. I'm sure that most of you are already familiar with Nick. He spent 20 years broadcasting for the BBC World Service, where he was Chief Producer Arts. And he won 2 UN awards. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. His first book for Faber, Dead Man's Chest, followed in Robert Louis Stevenson's footsteps from Scotland to Samoa, and was much enjoyed by Graham Greene. He then wrote 4 books about warfare: Telegram from Guernica, Churchill's Wizards, Ian Fleming's Commandos and Defending the Rock, and his 6th non-fiction book, Trapped in History, Kenya, Mau Mau and Me, is a personal memoir and a detailed study of a violent period in the 20th century decolonisation of Africa. Nick, in fact, grew up in Kenya during this troubled period. However, I would like to direct you to focus on Nick's seminal book, Dead Man's Chest, Travels After Robert Louis Stevenson, first published in 1987. As I shall elaborate, it has stood the test of time. I can recommend that you read it if you've not already done so, and it's also worthy of rereading. It's a meticulously researched, encyclopedic, biographical, and a veritable Stevenson travelogue. The contents listing specify Scotland, Cockfield, France, America, Hierre, Bournemouth, Saranac Lake, Hawaii, and Samoa. These travels intrigue me from my perspective of lifelong researches into travel medicine. Serendipitously, as recently as 8 days ago, I received an email from an inveterate Stevenson aficionado who lives in Germany. From previous emails, it seems like he makes annual pilgrimages to the UK in pursuit of visiting RLS associated locations. This year, on I think his second visit to the UK, he was visiting Cockfield. I inquired if he was familiar with Nick's Dead Man's Chest, which I thought had the potential to be a travelogue guide. His reply? Definitely. That was one facet from the book that he took, but more importantly, he volunteered that reading the book had converted him into a Stevensonian. And now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Nicholas to give his address to the memory of Robert Louis Stevenson.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come here today. And I do feel honoured, actually, and very grateful to say something on this occasion, about Robert Louis Stevenson in the city of his birth, in weather that he would have liked, because he used to go ice skating on Duddingston Loch, as you know, and on Moody Pond in Saranac Lake. He liked the snowy weather. And I'm here because, as John has said, because of this, my first book. Here is the original hardback with a Dan Fern cover. It's astonishing to think that 40 years ago, in November 1984, I was just back from the journey around the world that makes the subtitle Travels After Robert Louis Stevenson. So it is rather strange to be here as an older man, looking back at a book that somebody once described as very much a young man's book. It is a young man's book, and I am no longer. I've just read the book again which I haven't read for years. Okay, it was a very interesting experience. And as I say, I'm older now, but we have to remember that Stevenson did not have that privilege. He did not grow old. He was 44 years and 3 weeks old when he died of a stroke in his house at Vailima in faraway Samoa y Sisifo. Incidentally, if you haven't done so, I do recommend you pop into the National Library of Scotland, and there's a little exhibition about Tusitala in the Pacific. Mixed things, but there's a lovely little video I do recommend you see if you want to see what Stevenson's house looked like and to hear Samoan people speaking Samoan about Stevenson. It's worth looking at. And the great thing about it is they talk fondly of his memory. He is, you know, they are proud that Tusitala lived among them. So, well, here's the book. And what I'd like to do is sort of deconstruct or riff on the first pages of this book, okay? It all began in a second-hand bookshop in London on the 23rd of April, 1983. That's, I suppose, and Ian Nimmo might agree with me here, classic journalism, okay? It is what, and it is where, and it is when. When? 1983, that was the year I turned 33. And then why? I'd remembered how in Barcelona they celebrate San Jordi, St. George's Day, by giving the beloved a rose and a book. Now, I lived in Barcelona from 1975 to 1977, and St. Jordi is the patron saint of Catalonia, as he is the patron saint of Genoa, of Portugal, of Ethiopia, and a small country called England. Anyway, the first short story I ever published was about the night that Franco died in Barcelona. It was 49 years ago this week. And I have to tell you that you couldn't buy champagne anywhere in Barcelona the night the old bastard died. They were on the other side in the Spanish Civil War. And on the 23rd of April 1976, I remember this, San Jordi, their patron saint day, avui, which means today, the first newspaper in Catalan appeared on the streets of Barcelona. Franco had banned their language. So it was the first newspaper since the Civil War ended in 1939 to be published in their own language. One of the things about living in Barcelona was that you would read enormous articles in La Vanguardia, which is the paper there, about Scottish devolution and Scottish nationalism. They were not actually interested in Scottish nationalism. It was all an analogy of what they would hope to achieve in Catalonia. Just as in the Basque Country, you'd read a lot about Ireland. There, the model was Scotland. Okay. A rose is a rose is a rose, but the book, it says here, is in memory of Cervantes and Shakespeare, who both died on the 23rd of April, 1616. I always thought that means God is a librarian. But Shakespeare and Cervantes both reappear in this book. I was rather surprised to see when I read it again. When Shakespeare crossed the plains, do you remember Across the Plains, that book? He was travelling on a train, and he was often on the roof of the train, crawling across the plains of Nebraska. He's there in his shirt sleeves, and he's got that moustache and a Van Dyke beard and a notebook. And the other emigrants called him Shakespeare, because he was writing. And then Cervantes appears because in Saranac Lake in 1887, Stevenson read Don Quixote de la Mancha with a Spanish dictionary. And he said to Lloyd Osborne, he said, it was the saddest book he'd ever read. And he said to his stepson, that's just what I am. another Don Quixote. And there is that side to Stevenson that it's worth remembering. Anyway, the next line of the book is, so I went into the dusty bookshop and I bought to buy a book for my wife. Now, strictly speaking, she wasn't actually my wife at that moment. We had been courting for 4 months and then we married 4 months later. But she was my wife from our first night together, and she's still my wife, and she's hundreds of miles away now, 42 years later. I mention this because Stevenson was uxorious too. He had one wife and he loved her. My ideal is the female clan, he wrote, when in his 40s, when he was, as he said, entangled in petticoat strings. His women loved him too. We have to remember that Stevenson's mother, Stevenson's wife, and Stevenson's stepdaughter were with him when he died. Lloyd Osborne, his stepson, said in the 1920s that Stevenson was emphatically what we would call nowadays a feminist. And that's true. Stevenson wrote, "A man should never have been suckled at a woman's breast. He should never have slept in a woman's embrace, so far as to forget what is honourable in sentiment, what is essential in gratitude, or what is tolerable by other men." I have to say I don't like those largely male biographers who carp at Fanny Stevenson. And they do exist. I think they read RLS completely wrong. He loved this weird woman, as he called her. He described her as a violent friend and a brimstone enemy. Linda just pointed out to me now at lunch the marvellous poem that introduces Weir of Hermiston. It's a memory of Edinburgh, precipitous city, because the rain over Lammermuir. But he dedicates the book to her. It's a love poem to the city and to his wife. And I think those writers who attack Fanny, and there have been several, don't trust them. I don't think you can attack a man's wife and expect to get away with it. And I remember that phrase that he used in his defence of Father Damien when he went for him. He said, "With you I rejoice to thumb the button off the foil and to plunge home." A fellow has to die fighting, you know, he once said in Manasquan. So there is that side of him, the Don Quixote, the man who is prepared to stand up and struggle. He doesn't hold back. So in the second-hand bookshop, which I went into on St. George's Day in order to buy the beloved, this book, I bought a copy. It was an 1896 grey Longman paperback. There were paperbacks then. You know, it was old and grey. It was The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, the original novella, 1886, January 1886, didn't have a definite article. It was Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll. Interesting case. Stevenson uses the word case for a mysterious problem before Arthur Conan Doyle used case for Sherlock Holmes. And of course it's a medical term. I think they talk about cases for doctors. And this case, as we know, this case is the story not of one man becoming two men, but the mystery is that there are two different men who turn out to be the same man. It's a sort of novel about identity. He, I say. I cannot say I. Now, I is, of course, the letter of the alphabet between H for Hyde and J for Jekyll or Jekyll. And even that name, Jekyll or Jekyll, if you think of it in French, it's je kill. So what is this self, this I that he's talking about? Man is not truly one, but truly two, says Dr. Jekyll in his confession. I say two because in the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow. Others will outstrip me in the same lines. And I hazard the guess, this is what Jekyll says in 1886, I hazard the guess that man will ultimately be known as a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent denizens. Hello, Legion. Anyway, I gave the book to my wife Maggie with a red rose, and I wrote in the book, and I can remember this, to Dr. G, and then the handwriting became a maniac scrawl from Mr. Nick. Anyway, here is the book. We're still on the first page. We're going to be here like Ken Dodd till the end of the evening. Don't worry. Later, browsing in bed, I found other stories at the back of the volume. There were 20 fables, and I thought them brilliant. They did not fit my simple notion of Stevenson as an author of boys' books and shilling shockers. The writer of these consummate pieces was a scrupulous, self-conscious artist. Stevenson's fables reminded me of Jorge Luis Borges. So it didn't all begin in 1983, as I wrote in my book. That opening sentence of mine is wrong. Perhaps it really began in September 1973, when I sailed to Buenos Aires on a cargo ship from Naples with a copy of Borges' Ficciones, the first book I ever attempted to read in Spanish, working through it with a dictionary. Or perhaps all this began even earlier, in March 1967, when I was a schoolboy and I first found Borges in a copy of Time magazine in the school library, an article which I quite illicitly snipped out of the magazine and kept in the John Calder edition of Fictions, which I stole from my elder brother. Whenever it all may have begun, the point of it is this: it's through this blind Argentine writer, Jorge Luis Borges, that I came to Robert Louis Stevenson. When I started writing myself at the age of 30, first time I saw my name in print, the first public thing I did was to adapt 3 of Borges' story for the stage, for a fringe theatre group that I was in. Now, I did ring Borges to ask his permission to do this, and I got his number from Paul Theroux. This is a writer I'd never met in my life, but I knew that he knew Borges because he'd written about him in his book, The Old Patagonian Express. And Theroux's own telephone number I found in the old 4-volume London telephone directory. Now, you will all remember this, but if there's any young person here, I have to explain to you that in 1980, there was no internet, there was no email. You wrote letters and you put stamps on them which you bought at the post office. I've met young people who don't even know what a post office is, let alone go into them. There was no mobile phones, there was no Google, there was no Wikipedia, none of the jittery dither of Instagram and Snapchat and all the rest of it. None of that existed, okay? So I rang Borges from a Uranus red London telephone box with prostitutes' cards stuck on the windows, pressing 20p, 50p coins into the slot. The £1 coin, who had not yet been invented, was not introduced till 1984. This is incomprehensible to the young nowadays. They don't know what a phone box is. They think it's where tramps go to for their business. Anyway, but I knew exactly where Borges was when he answered that phone call and gave me permission, because he was on the 6th floor of Calle Maipú 994. It's a block or so from Plaza San Martin in Buenos Aires. I mean, I knew this place because in 1974 and in 1977 I lived in a hotel, the dear old Hotel Ocean, on the corner of his block, on the corner of Maipú and Paraguay. And I'd walked the same pavements as Borges. I down to Harrods. There was a branch of Harrods in Calle Florida, the Richmond Tea Room, which also appears in Graham Greene's honorary console, to the cinemas in Calle Lavalle. Borges loved the cinema, even though he was blind. Every Argentine knows that the south begins on the other side of Rivadavia, is one of his lines. Buenos Aires, mi querida. Anyway, in those days I was becoming a freelance journalist, okay, writing whatever pieces I could get. And in those days too, technology, I used a typewriter. Everybody used typewriters then. There were, as I say, no computers and email. You filed copy by hand, walking into the office to deliver it. And I remember the thing that in those days, cut and paste literally meant cut and paste. If you made a mistake, you typed the page out again, you cut it out with a pen, and then you stuck it onto the previous sheet. So if you had a manuscript, it buckled like kind of creaking papyrus. All that has vanished now. Well, it's not a good thing, but I'm just saying that's what it was like. And then suddenly, in April 1982, we were at war with Argentina, this country I'd lived in, this country I knew. Do you remember this? The Falklands-Malvinas War. Remember that? Two bald men fighting over a comb, Borges said. It was rather more than that, but this Falklands-Malvinas War stopped Borges from coming to England. He made that joke about two bald men fighting over a comb, but he also wrote a rather wonderful poem about it. It's called Juan Lopez and John Ward. And it's about two men, one from Buenos Aires, one from London, who both read books, who could have been friends, who only met once face to face in some two famous islands, he said. And each was Cain and each was Abel. They lie in the same grave. Snow and corruption know them. This happened in a time we cannot understand. Anyway, this war stopped him from coming, but he came the next year, 1983. And he came to London to deliver the first annual Jorge Luis Borges lecture to the Anglo-Argentine Society. Now, I had joined that society when the war broke out. And anyway, I found out what hotel he was staying at, and I went along to try and read to him. He's 84 years old, and he's blind. So he needs people to read to him. I thought this would be a good thing to do. And so I took along that old grey Longman paperback of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I took that because I had read his piece, Borges and I, in his 1960 book El Hacedor, The Maker, where he wrote that famous piece about really how he is two people. There is the I, a private, modest man, and then there is Borges, this public persona. And he wrote in that, I like our glasses, maps, 18th century typography, the roots of words, the taste of coffee, and Robert Louis Stevenson's prose. He, Borges, shares those preferences, but with a vanity that turns them into the attributes of an actor. Anyway, so I went along there and into this hotel to see Borges. And I'll just read this bit. The great man in dark suit, silk tie and white shirt was manoeuvred into a hotel lounge armchair by his beautiful secretary and travelling companion, Miss Maria Kodama. It's all right, Maria, thank you. Well, it's good of you to come see an old man. You bought something to read, no? Yes. Do you know Stevenson's fables? Of course. I have just translated them into Spanish to be published in Buenos Aires. Which one would you like to hear first? Song of the Morrow is a good one, no? Borges clasped the blackthorn walking stick before him with both hands and turned his great head to listen to the strange and circular fable. His face was ugly, then beautiful, luminous with changing emotions. Words were his element, and being read to was still a child's pleasure. Borges is spellbound, he said happily. There was only time for 4 fables before some other journalists arrived. "You must come back," said Borges. "Bring the essay on dreams." So I searched second-hand bookshops and I found a single tome that contained a chapter on dreams, volume 15 of the Thistle edition of Stevenson's works. It was late at night when I next saw Borges and Maria Kodama. They were sitting over coffee and biscuits in the lounge of their Mayfair hotel. I got the book, Borges. "Begin, begin! Está buscando lugar, Borges. He's looking for the place, Borges," scolded Maria in Spanish as she brushed some crumbs from his tweed overcoat. My hands shook as I scrabbled for the page. A Chapter on Dreams is a wonderful book. He dreamed all his life. Stevenson had amazing dreams. And it's also about how, he writes about how he had an unseen familiar, some brownie that helped him. He would dream at night and bits of the plot and story would come to him. He had an active cooperation and he wrote about it, you know, "I have some unseen collaborator whom I keep locked in the back garret while I get the praise and he but a share of the pudding. I'm an excellent adviser. I pull back and I cut down. I hold the pen too and do the sitting at the table, which is about the worst of it. So that on the whole I have some claim to share, though not so largely as I do, in the profit of our common enterprise." I gave Borges the book, described its colour, and he said, "This is the volume missing from my collection," which of course is completely untrue, but very nice. "What can I give you in return?" He spoke to Maria Kodama, who went upstairs and returned with the gift. It was a stone. I put it in my pocket and said good night. "Blessed is the man who finds no disillusion when he's brought face to face with a revered writer," wrote Rudyard Kipling after meeting Mark Twain in 1889. "Why did you not come and read when you were living in Buenos Aires?" Borges asked. "Because I was shy." "I understand. I too am shy." When Borges took your arm to be led, it was not like Blind Pew with Jim Hawkins. I held out my hand and the horrible, soft-spoken, eyeless creature gripped it in a moment like a vice. He had the trustfulness of a child and the charm of a witty old gentleman. The 3 of us walked to Shepherd Market to have lunch on their last day in London. We talked about films, amongst other things, because Borges always loved the cinema with an Argentine fervour. Maria described the decor of the pub, mock Victorian in flock, plush and brass. "Are there any hooligans?" asked Borges. We laughed at the luncheon table, and eventually Borges called for a toast. "What shall we drink it in, Borges?" "I think brown ale would be appropriate." From the Chesterton-coloured roaring winking bar, I brought back a small bottle of forest brown ale and filled the 3 glasses. "To Stevenson," said Borges, and we drank. Now, my wife, Maggie G, would then... Good afternoon.
Sorry.
An urgent work call. My wife, who was then a Faber author, told Robert McCrum, her editor at Faber, about my reading to Borges. Faber had just commissioned a very large biography of Stevenson from Roger Swearingen, and they knew it was going to take years. It still hasn't been written. They knew it was going to take some years, but so he thought that maybe, you know, a swift travel book by an enthusiast, someone like me, would help to pave the way. So he asked me if I would like to follow in the footsteps of Robert Louis Stevenson. Would I? Is the Pope? Do bears? Of course I would. And it was really the luckiest break of my life. It was a turning point in my life, a golden opportunity. The deal was done by Christmas 1983. They gave me £5,000 up front. That's pretty good. That was it. Normally you get a third on signature, a third on delivery, a third on publication. No, the whole lot up front, £5,000. But the rest was up to me. Fix all the travel yourself. Europe, America, the Pacific. Do what you want, go where you must. Deliver a manuscript. And that was it. I remembered Borges's gift then. It was a small, pockmarked, pinkish stone from an ancient city. A touchstone, Borges said, with a chuckle. Now, the touchstone was one of the fables that Stevenson wrote that we read together. It's a parable about two brothers seeking a stone which would test quality. Now, the younger finds a mirror which only shows the seeming of things, but the elder brother discovers the touchstone that reveals truth. And the fable ends with the words of the elder brother: "I will go forth into the world with my pebble in my pocket." And that's what I did. I took the pebble around the world, and that made this book. Now, I would like to read you one thing that I came across in my researches. It's the BBC transcript of Professor Jorge Luis Borges talking to George Bruce, and it was broadcast at 9:05 p.m. on the BBC Home Service on the 26th of August, John Buchan's birthday, irrelevant, but there we are, in 1963. The subject is Robert Louis Stevenson, and this is what Borges said. "I think that Stevenson was not only a great writer, but a great man. I mean, he took his literary vocation very much in earnest. I remember he once wrote that if you were a writer, you might make very little money, but that you had your reward in the fact that you could influence many people and influence them for the good. I remember he wrote about somebody that he had suffered a great deal, but that he died with a will to smile. That, of course, might be autobiographical of Stevenson himself. I mean that in Stevenson I have found not only a very charming writer. He wrote that charm was the only virtue really worth anything in literature. But if you had no charm, everything else went for nothing. But I also think of him, of course, I never met him in the flesh. I also think of him as a personal friend of mine. And I think it is highly important that all over the world one meets with personal friends of Stevenson who are his friends simply because they have read him." And that means all of us, ladies and gentlemen. We are here at this lunch in Edinburgh because we are friends of Stevenson. Because we have read him and we like him. As Borges once said, if you don't like Stevenson, there must be something wrong with you. So what do we like about Stevenson? Let me just, before we all fall asleep, he is eminently sane. He is funny. Remember when he was in New York and he had this terrible itch. He'd arrived on the Devonia, got some frightful itch, and he goes into, dripping with rain, it's absolute nightmare. He goes into a chemist on Broadway, and there's a ponderous gentleman in fine linen who gives him a blue pill and a sidelids powder. And Stevenson writes, he might as well have given me a cricket bat and a copy of Johnson's dictionary. He is sensible about the literary life. A New Zealand journalist asked him, "Mr. Stevenson, how do you write?" And Stevenson said, "Read, read, read." There's no writing without reading. All this stuff about people say, "I don't want to be influenced." Rubbish. Stevenson, as he said, played the sedulous ape to many writers. He read them all. Sometimes he copied them, but he became his own man because he absolutely loved language. Borges said, "I would rather have written a page of Stevenson than a book full of Kafka." Vladimir Nabokov admired him, as did Virginia Woolf, who praised his quick, exact glance at visible things. Okay. Stevenson, we like Stevenson because he lived through his ages. That's what he recommended other people should do. Okay. Fiction is to a grown man what play is to the child. I don't know if you've read his essay on child's play, but and every account of Stevenson as a child, an absolute fury of play. There never was a child who played better than Stevenson. Were you ever marooned? All these imaginative ideas. And this is the other thing that is amazing. He is the first writer to write from the child's point of view. A Child's Garden of Verses is a revolutionary book. I wish I had Michael Rosen with me here to back this point up. He wrote a thesis for, I think, Reading University, which he showed me. And it's true. No one else had ever managed to, write about children, but not seeing the world through the eyes of a child. And it's a marvellous book and terrific. We could quote them till the end of time. And then as he grows older, of course he was a rebellious adolescent and a free thinker and a bohemian. He was young, for God's sake. What did he describe himself? A lean, feverish, voluble and whiskey-fied zany Scot who sparked through Britain bent on art and the pleasures of the flesh. What could be better? And then slovenly youth was all right, but in his 40s, not slovenly age. So really now I'm pretty spruce. Always a white shirt, white necktie, fresh shave, silk shocks. Oh, a great sight. Stevenson was a precise and excellent writer, okay? And he's the first man to write the physical sensations and emotions of exhaustion and fear, and how fear can prompt courage. In David Balfour, that, what does he describe it? That kind of anger of despair. No one had done this before Kidnapped. There is movement in books, but not that kind of sensation. There'd be no Richard Hannay running over the moors in 39 steps if Stevenson hadn't done it before. So he kind of invented the adventure story, and he invented the pirate yarn, for goodness sake. There wouldn't be Pirates of the Caribbean, all those movies, and Speak Like a Pirate Day if it wasn't for Stevenson. I mean, is there a better first novel than Treasure Island? Is there? I challenge anybody, pistols at dawn, to find one that for a first novel has never been out of print. Just amazing. And you know the story, how it was written, starting with a map. And out of that, he sees the bright weapons and brown faces of the pirates coming out of the map. The fact that he wrote 15 chapters a day reading them to his parents, and they got jammed. And he goes off to Davos, young folks is printing it. They said, where's the rest of the book? And if you go back to the book, look what happens at chapter 15. He gets himself out of a jam by switching the point of view to the doctor. The doctor narrates it, and then he wrote it in another 15 days. He wrote the book in 30 days. Can't get a first novel like that nowadays. No. Anyway, and what else is he? He is kind of the precursor of cinema. Bertolt Brecht admired die filmische Optik that he saw in Stevenson's writing. The way Stevenson described reading. He wanted reading to fill our mind with the busiest kaleidoscopic dance of images, and the story to repeat itself in 1,000 coloured pictures to the eye. This is before the invention of cinema, ladies and gentlemen. It is extraordinary. He's living on the cusp of a new age. He first picks up a telephone and hears the voice of a stagecoach driver over in Silverado. Lloyd has a typewriter in Saranac Lake. Just as Kipling was the first to use motor cars and films and wireless in his, I think Stevenson is the first novelist to use the telephone as a part of the plot in The Wrecker, where two people have heard each other's voices but don't know what the other looks like. Our technology is all different now. But more than all this rubbish that I've just taught, what is really important about Stevenson is that he is ethical, he is moral, he is honourable, he is brave. He's ready to defend the Curtin women in Ireland when their man was murdered. Well, he didn't need to go and do it because Being strong Irish women, they went out and killed the man themselves. But he was ready to defend Father Damien, when he was attacked by the Protestant missionary. They said he'd slept with the leper women and it was a form of syphilis. And Stevenson's defence, he was prepared to be ruined, but he did it. He stood up for Mataafa, the Samoan chief. He stood on the side of the indigenous people against the wrongs of imperialism. He was a good man. And the thing about this is that because he's a good man, the people who love him are loyal to him. And I'd just like to give you very quickly 3 examples of people who are loyal to Robert Louis Stevenson. The first of these is Ernest Mayhew. All these people, these 3 people, were friends or are friends of mine. Ernest Mayhew. Nobody can read Stevenson now or know anything about Stevenson or write about Stevenson without the 8 volumes of Stevenson's letters. This is one of the most remarkable pieces. Ernest Mayhew didn't go to university. His father was a chicken farmer. He got into Huntington Grammar School because he wrote an essay, What Jim Overheard in the Apple Barrel. He had a teacher called Vera who encouraged him in Stevenson. He bought all those, what are the blue editions with the palm tree on that makes the club tie? The Tusitala edition. He bought all those volumes. This is in the war. He has to join the army. He ends up a senior warrant officer in Waziristan, which is, Taliban bandit country now. And this is the highest rank you can get to without being commissioned. He was a bloody good soldier. When he came back, he joined the civil service. He was in the milk marketing board, rose to be a very senior civil servant. Still kept his interest in Stevenson. Janet Adams Smith, she put an ad in the TLS saying, I need someone to help me with Stevenson's poetry. Ernest turns up. He's so good that she passes his arm to her publisher, Rupert Hart Davies, who gets him to work on the letters of Oscar Wilde. Now, there are 2 names on the collected letters, Bradford A. Booth and Ernest Mayhew. Well, Bradford A. Booth was hopeless. He died as well. Ernest did the whole thing himself. He went back over the work, single-handed, with his wife Joyce Wilson, another grammar school girl. 8 volumes, no computer, brilliant footnotes. When Ernest died, his wife had dementia, they had no children. I became his executor because this brings me to the second person who was loyal to Stevenson, Roger Swearingen. Now, Roger Swearingen, who lives in California, fantastic scholar on Stevenson, is the greatest living expert on Stevenson now. Very much an acolyte of Ernest's. He has published, the Guide to the Prose Writings was a major breakthrough in Stevenson studies. He has brought back into print, he's now just done a version of In the South Seas, which is bringing back stuff that has not seen the light of day. Whether his great book will come, but he's produced lots of things, John Nicholson, talks, lectures, papers. He's a great man. Well, when Ernest died, I got Roger to come over. We went into Ernest's house and we got all his books and papers up here to Edinburgh. Okay? The papers went to the National Library of Scotland, and Linda Dryden so wonderfully got Napier to take the books, which are now in the Mayhew room. So this great mind dedicated to Stevenson rescued. And there's the third person, the final person who is my friend, is Mike Delahant at Saranac Lake. Now, in my book, I went there, I knocked on the door, and this man opened the door. We shook hands. We're the same age. We were both born in 1950. Stevenson was born in 1850. And just as Stevenson had a curious thing about Ferguson, who was born in 1750, I don't know. But Mike had moved in to look after this house because his grandfather and his father had done it. Now, he has looked after that house for more years than Stevenson was alive. He's had to defend it like the stockade on Treasure Island, from people who wanted to steal it, sell it to Landmark Trust, get rid of the stuff, bad boards. But it is a brilliant place. If you ever go to America, or some of you have been, you will see it has marvelous things. Do go there. And there was a conference. Some of you were there. Mitchell was there. Linda was there. And at that conference, remember the Pebble and the Stevenson book? I gave those to that museum. So If I ever wanted, I could have bought the pebble here today, but no, it's there in Saranac, because for me that is one of the best places. Now, there used to be a tradition that on Stevenson's birthday, the 13th of November, all the Stevenson societies around the world, or the Scottish Club of Honolulu, they would send each other telegrams. And the last time I spoke at this club, and I can't remember when it was, it must have been maybe about 1990 or somewhere, I did actually read out, or the president then read out, an actual telegram from the post office. Young people don't know what a telegram is, you know, from Saranac Lake. But so this time, Mike has sent another message, the resident curator. He sent another message to you, and this is how it goes. The Stevenson Society of America, founded in 1915, sends warmest, best greetings to its younger sibling, the Robert Louis Stevenson Club of Edinburgh, founded in 1920. Both are institutions that cherish the memory and sustain the spirit of RLS. And from the other side of the Atlantic, we hereby charge our British representative, Nicholas Rankin, to ask you, gathered at your annual lunch in Edinburgh, to hereby charge your glasses preparatory to a toast. Please fill your glasses, or whatever you have. Are you ready? To Robert Louis Stevenson, great heart. Here endeth the lesson.